Hi, I'm Mr. New Jersey. Today I want to discuss the 9 cities that have served as capitals of the United States, and the important events that occurred while each was the capital. When I use the word capitals in this video, I refer to cities where Congress has met since it declared the U.S. independent in 1776. Congress actually formed before the United States was formed, when in autumn of 1774, 12 British colonies in America sent delegates to Philadelphia to discuss how the colony should respond to what many perceived as British oppression. At the time, Congress had only one legislative house, and although different colonies sent different numbers of delegates, each colony had only one vote. This first meeting of Congress occurred in a building called Carpenter's Hall. While there, Congress organized a boycott of British goods, and resolved to meet again the following year. Thus, Congress resumed meeting in 1775. This meeting was held in Philadelphia at what was then the Pennsylvania State House, the building known today as Independence Hall. 13 colonies sent delegates to this meeting. Tensions between the colonists and the British continued to worsen, so over the course of several months, Congress organized a militia, and war broke out between the colonies and the British government. Finally, on July 2, 1776, Congress voted to make the 13 colonies independent from Britain as the United States of America. Since Congress was meeting in Philadelphia at the time, this also made Philadelphia the first capital of the United States. Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, a document explaining why the delegates had voted for independence. 2 days later, on July 4th, Congress continued to meet in Philadelphia until December of 1776, when it moved to Baltimore, Maryland, because the British Army was getting too close to Philadelphia for comfort. Specifically, Congress met in a place called the Henry Fight House. While there, Congress learned of the American victories in the battles of Trenton and Princeton, which pushed the British further away from Philadelphia. Congress moved back to Philadelphia in March of 1777 when it felt safe again. However, the British were not done trying to take Philadelphia, and in mid-1777 they actually succeeded in capturing the city. This forced Congress to flee westward into Pennsylvania, giving us the next 2 capitals of the United States. Firstly, Congress met for a single day, September 27, 1777, in the courthouse of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Congress then proceeded further west, settling in for the better part of a year in the courthouse of York, Pennsylvania. The main reason for the move was that Congress wanted to put another natural barrier, the Susquehanna River, in between themselves and the British. While in York, Congress adopted the Articles of Confederation, which was the first Constitution of the United States. In this instance, the word Constitution means a document that outlines the country's government structure. The Articles of Confederation gave the central government very little power, instead leaving most responsibilities to the state governments. For instance, Congress could not levy taxes. Instead, it had to ask states to give it money, and the states often did not comply. In terms of government structure, Congress continued to have only one legislative house, in which every state had one vote, and there was not a distinct executive branch of government, meaning that Congress's ability to enforce its laws was incredibly limited. Pretty much all Congress could do was run its army and conduct diplomacy, but even then, it was often unable to pay its soldiers because it couldn't tax its citizens. In any case, the Articles of Confederation was the most significant thing to happen while Congress met in York. Once the Americans retook Philadelphia in the summer of 1778, Congress moved back there. They returned to find that the British had occupied the State House and left it in a very dirty condition. As a result, Congress actually met first in a building called College Hall, which was part of the College of Philadelphia, which is now the University of Pennsylvania, and only moved back to the State House once it was cleaned up. The last major battle of the War for Independence, which occurred at Yorktown, Virginia in 1781, ended with an American victory, so the process of negotiating a treaty with the British began. However, during this process, a lot of American soldiers began to protest in Philadelphia because Congress had not paid them. Remember what I said earlier about Congress not being allowed to levy taxes and just hoping the states gave them money? You see the problem. Congress decided to leave Philadelphia once again to put distance between itself and the protesters. Specifically, it moved to Nassau Hall in Princeton, New Jersey, where it met for several months in mid-1783. The most important thing to happen while Congress was in Princeton was the signing of the Treaty of Paris, which ended the War for Independence with British recognition of America's independence. While in Princeton, Congress also received the first minister from a foreign country to the United States, specifically a minister of the Netherlands. As part of its continuing effort to avoid Philadelphia, Congress wound up at the Maryland State House in Annapolis, Maryland. Congress met there from late 1783 until mid-1784, during which time George Washington resigned as Commander-in-Chief of the American Army, a post he had held throughout the War for Independence, and Congress ratified the Treaty of Paris. Congress spent November and December of 1784 at the French Arms Tavern in Trenton, New Jersey, during which time Marquis de Lafayette, a French military officer who had fought for the U.S. during the war, gave a farewell address, but not much else of significance happened. Congress moved to New York City, New York, in January 1785, and would remain there until August 1790. A lot of important things occurred while New York was the capital. Firstly, the United States changed constitutions. Remember our discussion of how weak the central government was under the Articles of Confederation? Well, a lot of problems had arisen as a result. Inability to pay soldiers, difficulties in putting down Shays' rebellion, etc. So, a lot of Americans believed it was necessary to alter the Articles to provide a stronger central government. Even though New York City was the capital, the convention held to discuss changes to the Articles occurred at the then Pennsylvania State House in Philadelphia, using a delegation distinct from Congress. It occurred in mid-1787. The delegates quickly determined that merely amending the Articles would not bring about the level of reform required, so the convention began working to create an entirely new constitution to replace the Articles. This convention is what Americans know as the Constitutional Convention. The constitution it proposed would create a government with distinct legislative, executive, and judicial branches. The legislative branch, Congress, would have two houses, the Senate, in which all states would have 2 members, and the House of Representatives, in which states would have a number of representatives proportionate to their population. The executive branch would be led by a president, and the judicial branch would be composed of a Supreme Court and whatever additional courts Congress would decide to make. Congress would be given various powers that it had not had under the Articles of Confederation, such as the power to levy taxes. Importantly for this video, the proposed Constitution said that a permanent U.S. capital would be established, separate from any of the states, using land donated to the central government by one or more of the states for that purpose. Following the Constitutional Convention, the proposed Constitution went to Congress in New York for approval. Congress approved the Constitution, but before it would take effect, it still had to be ratified by at least 9 states, a process which took until late 1788. In 1789, with New York still serving as the capital of the U.S., the government based on the new Constitution began operating. It's worth mentioning that up until this point, Congress had been meeting in New York City Hall, not to be confused with the modern New York City Hall, which is entirely different. But right around the time the new Constitution began operating, the then New York City Hall was remodeled and expanded to fit Congress's needs and renamed Federal Hall. Anyway, with New York as the seat of the new government, George Washington was elected and inaugurated as the first president of the United States. Congress approved amendments to the Constitution that became the Bill of Rights, and, critically for purposes of this video, Northerners and Southerners reached the Compromise of 1790. You see, 2 major political issues at the time were deciding where to locate the permanent capital of the U.S. that the Constitution prescribed, and the problem of northern states having lots of unpaid debt left over from the War for Independence. Northerners wanted the central government to assume states' debts, which Southerners did not want, and both Northerners and Southerners wanted the capital to be located in their regions. The Compromise of 1790 provided that the central government assumed the debts, which would primarily benefit Northerners, and in exchange the capital would be located in the South. Specifically, it would be located somewhere along the Potomac River. Maryland and Virginia both donated land for the purpose. Lastly, while government buildings for the permanent capital were being constructed, Philadelphia would serve as the capital temporarily. Thus, Congress, the President, and the Supreme Court all moved to Philadelphia in December of 1790. Specifically, Congress moved to a building now called Congress Hall, while the President and the Supreme Court were in separate buildings. Philadelphia remained the capital until mid-1800, when the move to the permanent capital, Washington, District of Columbia, occurred. Washington, D.C. has been the capital of the United States ever since. However, there are some important developments to note. Firstly, the current Capitol building and Executive Mansion are not the original ones, since the British burned down the originals when they occupied the city during the War of 1812. Second, since most government buildings were located on the Maryland side of the Potomac River, the land that Virginia had donated was eventually given back to Virginia. Today, that land is the city of Arlington and about half of the city of Alexandria. Third, the Supreme Court initially met in the U.S. Capitol building, not receiving its own building until the 20th century. Fourth, Maryland and Washington, D.C. have since grown culturally closer to the North than the South, so don't be thrown off by the fact that D.C. was once considered Southern. It no longer is. Fifth, because D.C. is not a state, its citizens do not have full representation in the federal government. So we'll make a whole separate video about that issue sometime in the future. Normally I end my videos with an extended tourism segment, but since I discussed so many sites in this video, for now I'll just stick to telling you which still exist and which don't. And I'll link websites relating to the ones that still exist in the video description. First off, many of Philadelphia's historic buildings are remarkably well preserved. Independence Hall, Congress Hall, and the Supreme Court building are all part of Independence National Historic Park. Also part of the park is the site where the President's Mansion used to be, though now it's just a small archaeological site with some informational plaques and videos around it. Carpenter's Hall is also a tourist attraction, separate from the park, but located nearby. Lastly, the modern University of Pennsylvania does have a building called College Hall, but it's not the same College Hall that Congress used, so as far as I can tell, Congress's College Hall no longer exists. Continuing with the theme of buildings that no longer exist, the Henry Fite House in Baltimore and the Lancaster Courthouse have both burned down. The York Courthouse was also destroyed, but a replica of it has since been built, which is part of something called the Colonial Complex. Nassau Hall in Princeton still exists, but the hall is privately owned by Princeton University and serves as the university's main administrative center. The Maryland State House where Congress met is still the Maryland State House today, although the rooms where the Maryland legislature and Congress met back then are different from the rooms in which the legislature meets now, which actually works out well for tourists because the old legislative rooms are always free to be set up for tourism with informational plaques and displays. The French Arms Tavern in Trenton was torn down in the 1830s. Federal Hall National Memorial in New York City commemorates the site where Congress met when New York was the capital. But the building called Federal Hall, which is there now, wasn't the Federal Hall that Congress met in, since Congress's Federal Hall was demolished, and the building there now originally served as the United States Custom House in New York. Last up is Washington, D.C. You can visit all three branches of government, though if you want to visit the White House, you have to book way in advance so they can run a background check on you. I hope you found this video useful and informative. If you did, please like and subscribe. Have a nice day, and I'll see you next time.